Hello students, welcome to week 2 for COM 403, Communication Theory. This week we are looking at relationship development within communication theory and relevant theories and concepts that relate to that idea. When we look at the week 2 agenda, we are reading chapters 6, 7, and 8. You'll see now that the chapters move into each theory as a chapter. So essentially we're going through 3 theories this week. We're looking at and watching videos on coordinated management of meaning theory, expectancy violations theory, as well as social penetration theory. In addition to that, you're completing discussion board number 2 no later than Friday with replies due on Sunday, as well as selecting your midterm topic by Sunday. When we look at discussion board number 2, we are answering 2 questions for each theory we are going through. It's important that you thoroughly analyze and reflect upon the theories we're considering this week and construct a thoughtful answer that includes references to the course and at least one outside text within your questions. You should, for this discussion, construct a 100-word response for each theory. So there's at least 100 words for each theory. There's 3 theories, so we're expecting you to write at least 300 words total at a minimum for this discussion. Read through the questions. They're all related to each theory that we're going through this week in the reading as well as in this lecture and the other supplementary videos. If you have any questions with that, please get in touch with me. Just as a reminder, the replies are due on Sunday to at least 2 students, and you need to post this no later than Friday. Your midterm rationale. So in your midterm rationale, which is due this week, you will pick one theory from the list you see here as well as in Blackboard. You'll identify the theory that you would like to focus on for your midterm project. And in doing that, you'll write a 300-word rationale utilizing the theory that you've selected and providing a list of at least 3 outside academic sources that you plan to use in your midterm. So to understand this further, the midterm project will require you to analyze the use and effectiveness of one communication theory. You will be required to present the analysis of your theory in a YouTube presentation or a video presentation on YouTube, Vimeo, or as a voice thread. Any of those formats will suffice, as well as writing a 3 to 5 page paper. So you'll write a 3 to 5 page paper about the theory and then present the information from your paper in a YouTube or a voice thread. So essentially that's not due till week 4. We're in week 2. This week you're selecting your theory and writing a 300-word rationale as to why you want to analyze and view this theory as beneficial for that project, and providing a list of at least 3 academic sources you plan to use for your midterm. If you have any questions with that, please let me know. This week, we will spend some time diving a little deeper into the views of communication. As we start to get into communication theory a little more deeply, and we start to look at communication theory from different perspectives, it's important to understand and realize that there are different views to communication. Specifically, there are 2 primary views of communication known as transmission and as ritualistic. So the transmission view was really developed, both of them were really developed by James in the early 1940s, and really what it found was that communication takes place along a line. And what James Carey found and told us was that communication takes place between 2 fixed points, a source and a receiver, which you can see in the image here, beginning with the sender and ending with the receiver. Now that line can go back, meaning the receiver can turn into the source and the source can become the receiver. But all of this linear perspective in communication really tells us that and considers that the transmission process of communication and not the actual communication itself. We're looking at communication as a transmission. We do this a lot in media and mass communication theories. We look at it and we see how we're sending communication to one another and determine if that's an effective way to do so. So right now I'm sending you information through a video that's posted on YouTube, and that's the transmission of the communication. We're looking just at how we're transmitting it in a transmission view, not looking at what the communication itself is and the effectiveness in that. Shannon and Weaver expanded this model of source message receiver or source receiver in 1949 and determined that communication is encoded by a sender and decoded by a receiver. That all communication is linear, meaning the transmission takes place on a line, and we can track how communication moves and what communication is by looking at that linear perspective, that line, and find that everything starts with the source, everything ends with the receiver. There's a message in there in the middle, and the source encodes it, develops that message, and it's decoded before it's received. Essentially saying that if we look at this from a social media perspective, if I have something I want to say and I'm going to put it on Twitter, I'm going to put it in 280 characters now and send it to the world, and they will decode it and receive it that way. If I have that same message and I want to put it on Instagram, what am I going to do? I'm going to show a visual image of it, post a caption, and send it. So my encoding on Instagram is different than my encoding on Twitter. That's what the linear perspective, or the Shannon-Weaver model of communication, this linear perspective, tells us, that all communication has a source, it's encoded, the message is sent, it's decoded, and a receiver receives it, and then it can go back and forth. Again, we're looking at the transmission and the linear part of communication, not necessarily the communication itself. Moving a little more deeply, we look at ritualistic communication. James Carey again told us that communication is linear, but he also told us that it's ritualistic. That communication sometimes isn't about how we send the messages and which line that it goes across and how it's encoded and decoded, but communication is about is between a sender and receiver, and it's about sharing meaning with one another through an experience. It's not about the impartation of messages, but about what the messages are. Carey further told us that communication is an experience with another completed as part of a ritual. So communication really is not a part of this impartation of messages between senders and receivers. Rather, it's designed to be an experience with another and completed as part of a ritual we do as humans. Really, Carey found that through his explorations with the transmission model that communication is deeper than just the process of transmitting messages and utilizing linear models to communicate. What he really found was that we should consider the ritual of how we communicate and what we are communicating rather than the transmission we are using to get that particular message transmitted and out. He really contended that we gather oftentimes more information from the ritual, meaning our experience of communication, than considering the transmission of the communication itself. Peters further corroborated this, meaning further told us that true communication is really an inner experience. So if communication is an experience, that means it's a ritual that we do and we impart with one another. Jamie Smith, a noted theologian and Christian scholar, tells us that humans are homoliturgical in nature. We're designed to worship and commune with God and with one another. And in such, if we're homoliturgical and designed to worship and commune, we are looking at the rituals and the experiences of communicating with God and one another. Ong is a noted communication historian who's told us communication takes place within the community and shapes the culture of a community. That's not looking at the transmission or the ritual. The transmission or the linear model that it takes place on. It's looking at the ritual, rather. And as such, it's important to realize that and to keep that in mind. As we move into the theories this week, it's important to look at and see that our first theory is social penetration theory. Social penetration theory is an objective theory. It's firmly rooted in the socio-psychological tradition, and it's firmly rooted in scientific-based objective nature of theory developed by Altman and Taylor. What they have told us is that social penetration is the process of developing deeper intimacy with another person through mutual self-disclosure and other forms of vulnerability. Really, it proposes that relationships developed in interpersonal communications move from relatively shallow to more intimate conversations as you get to know someone. So I will tell you more about myself and my intimate well-being the more I get to know you. So if I just met you, I'm going to give you those cursory exchanges of communication, telling you not things that are too personal, but things that we maybe will tell anybody. As I get to know you, you're my spouse, you're my bestie, you're my sister, you're somebody like that, I'm going to tell you more. And more deeply put, Altman and Taylor compared people to onions. Really, what they found was that personality structures are like onion-like layers of beliefs and feelings about self, others, and the world. Deeper layers are more vulnerable, protected, and central to our self-image. Self-disclosure is the voluntary sharing of personal history, preferences, attitudes, feelings, values, secrets with another person, and is considered being transparent. As we look at ourselves as an onion, we typically will tend to peel back those layers as we develop interpersonal relationships with one another through communication. Looking at it from this perspective, we can see that the onion has 4 different or 5 different layers. There's superficial, intimate, and personal layers, and then our core. What Altman and Taylor found was that there are 4 stages of relationship development. In these stages, they found that we have an orientation phase, where we give cursory information that maybe we'll tell one another, basic information about ourselves. Oh, I'm married, I have 2 children, and maybe get into, if I don't know somebody very well, I'll talk about how my kids and how they go to school. Everybody says, oh, talk about somebody's kids or their pets or their family and things like that. Exploratory affective development means we're starting to get more into that intimate level. Affective exchange is in that personal level, and the core is that stable exchange. Recent changes have really brought social penetration theory into this idea of communication privacy management. And under this assumption, the theory considers a more in-depth, robust perspective of how we manage privacy within our communication and peel back the communicative layers in an onion in a way to maintain privacy control. However, Altman and Taylor have told us that there are different depths and breadths of self-disclosure. Depth of penetration is the degree of disclosure in a specific area of an individual's life. Breadth of penetration is the range of areas in an individual's life over which disclosure takes place. When we look at the law of reciprocity, we can see that a paced, orderly process in which openness in one person leads to openness in another, you tell me your dream, I'll tell you mine, helps us become more intimate with one another communicatively. So social exchanges are a valued part of this theory, telling us that relationship behavior and status regulated by both parties, evaluations of perceived rewards and costs of interactions with another, help us peel back those layers even further. And so looking at this, you can see where this really fits in. It's very scientifically based. We can look at it and say we peel back the layers through these 4 stages of relationship development, and this happens in this manner these times over and over and over again. Moving more towards an interpretive perspective of communication, firmly rooted in the socio-cultural and phenomenological traditions, is coordinated management of meaning. Coordinated management of meaning relies on a number of different things. It's been argued that this theory can fit within the ritualistic perspective of communication, telling us that it's not about the impartation of messages, but the ritual of communicating. Other theorists will tell us, or scholars in the field will tell us, that CMM is firmly rooted in the transmission model of communication, picturing communication as a transfer of meaning by a source sending a message through a channel to a receiver. Communication perspective is an ongoing focus of how communication makes our social worlds work. And so thinking about communication in that sense will tell us that, help us understand CMM further. It's definitely provided in terms of looking at this from a social constructivist point of view. Understanding and knowing how CMM works tells us that when somebody has a conversation with us, we create our own social realities. Pearson Conan, the developers of this theory believes that this happens naturally in our everyday interactions. In fact, we construct these social realities, and as we do this, we assign meaning to those interactions. Cognitively, we assign a meaning to that reality to store and recall them as needed when similar situations occur. So, if you've ever been in a doctor's office, you understand and know that social reality and can recall and assign meaning to those realities and recall them and use them as needed when you interact with doctors. You know there's a certain decorum in a doctor's office. It's usually a small white box of a room. You know naturally you need to sit on the exam table. The doctor's going to sit on the little tiny round chair. You can assign meaning to these things and help understand what makes sense of it as you look through this theory. Really, it's important to know that when we look at communication perspectives, it happens in one of 3 ways. We have we apply coordination, coherence, and mystery to the ideas of CMM. When we look at it from that perspective, we know that coordination directs our attention to the ways actions come together to produce patterns. So we assign meaning through coordination by looking at how actions come together to produce patterns. We either use coherence, which is looking at and calling attention to the stories that we tell that make lives meaningful, and pay attention to the construction of meaning and the primary form of that story. Or we use mystery, considering any social patterns that do not fit within the coordination that exists within lives and the mystery around us. This theory is heavily influenced by culture, communicative interactions, and interpersonal communication. It's important to know that the text provides us with the LUT model, which is an acronym that tells us that we look at lived stories, unknown stories, untold stories, unheard stories, and untellable stories to assign meaning. And you can look at that a little more deeply. We always measure coordinated patterns of interaction within coordinated management of meaning. There's always a difference or tension between our stories told and stories lived, and that's because we can craft these stories to be coherent and consistent, but the stories we live intersect with the actions and reactions of others. Pearce and Cronin were particularly concerned with patterns of communication we create with others. They offered the serpentine model, which is in the chapter that shows us how we construct meaning with stories. Essentially, we found that CMM claims we create our social worlds through our patterns of communication. It follows that we get what we make. Pearce has told us that if your patterns of interaction contain destructive accusations and reactive angers, you will most likely make a defensive relationship. If your patterns contain genuine questions and curiosity, you have a better chance of making a more open relationship. Particularly, Pearce urged that we ask 3 questions when we reflect on past interactions in the midst of our current conversation to contemplate what we might say in the future in terms of assigning meaning and managing that. How did that get made? What are we making? And what are we doing to make better social worlds? In seeing that, you can see that CMM is really influential in looking at dialogical communication, conversations in which parties remain, the tension between holding their own perspectives while being profoundly open to the other. It's really, really interesting when you look at it and you see it from that perspective, and you'll see some ideas presented in the conversation with a theorist presented by Pearce in our video we're going to watch this week, and look at it from that perspective. So what we're looking at essentially in CMM is how it's heavily influenced by culture, communicative interactions, and interpersonal communication, but understanding that we assign meaning to messages when we communicate with one another. The next theory we're going to look at this week is expectancy violations theory. This theory tells us an objective theory in the socio-psychological tradition. It focuses on nonverbal communication. And really what it's telling us is that the theory analyzes how individuals respond to unanticipated violations of social norms and expectations. We're looking at nonverbal communication. It's important for me to reiterate that. We're not looking at the verbal exchanges that we have with one another, but the nonverbal cues that we receive. And when there are unanticipated violations of social norms and expectations, expectancy violations theory steps in. It's considered a theory when a person expects you to act a certain way, but you do not act that way, and then it violates their perception of you. It deals with ideas of expectancy, what people predict will happen rather than what they desire, as well as looking at promixis and personal space. And so when we look at that, it's important for us to see that personal space is the invisible variable volume of space surrounding an individual that defines the individual's preferred distance from others. Promixis is the study of people's use of space as a special elaboration of culture. And so with that, we found that there's an intimate distance, which is 0 to 18 inches, a personal distance, which is 18 inches to 4 feet, a social distance, which is 4 to 12 feet, and a public distance, which is 12 to 25 feet that we keep with one another. Hence, the sign that I put up in this image tells us that if you're reading this, you are too close to me. So really what happens is that Judy Burgeon, a communication scholar in the University of Arizona, told us that we need to have nonverbal expectancy violations model that helps us understand and know when we have been, our expectancies of people and social norms and nonverbal communication have been violated. We look at this in a threshold. The hypothetical outer boundary of intimate space is a breach that has been breached by an uninvited occasions of fight or flight. It's really important to see that when you look at some of the core concepts of EVT, we rely on expectancy, violation, variance, and communicator reward variance. So expectancy is when what people predict will happen rather than what happens. It's important to know that Burgeon uses the words with her colleagues is to prefer to reserve the term expectancy for what is predicted to occur rather than what is desired. She suggests that the process the context, type of relationship, and characteristics of others automatically so that you can gauge what they might do. We have to look at the context, relationship, and communicator characteristics when we look at our expectancy, our expectancy is of one another. Context begins with cultural norms. 3 feet is too close to a person in England or Germany, yet it's too far removed in Saudi Arabia, where you can't trust people won't let you smell your breath. The context also includes the setting of the conversation. A classroom environment dictates a greater speaking distance than would an appropriate distance for a private chat in your professor's office. Relationship are factors that include similarity, familiarity, liking, and relative status. Burgeon discovered that people of all ages and stations in life anticipate lower status people will keep the distance because of our age difference and teacher-student relationship. The communicator characteristics include all of the demographic facts requested on applications, but they also include personal features that may affect expectation even more. Physical appearance, personality, communication style, and so on. Dawn's warm smile was a counterpoint to Belinda's caustic comments. And in this, you could assume that one would draw close to Dawn and Belinda would keep her distance. It really changes from person to person. Violation variance is the perceived positive or negative value assigned to the breach of expectations regardless of who the violator is. So usually it's the term net worth that comes from the field of accounting, but it captures the same idea. If somebody moves too close to us, we have a violation variance and we have to adjust that. We're either going to move back a little bit or maybe move in a little more or move to the side and adjust ourselves to fit that. Communicator reward variance is the sum of positive and negative attributes brought to the encounter plus the potential reward in the future. EVT is not the only theory that describes the tendency to size up other people in terms of potential rewards they have to offer. We find this in social penetration theory as well. The question is, what can you do for me and what can I do for you crosses our minds in every communicative interaction. Burgeon, in this sense, is not a cynic, but she thinks the issue of reward potential moves from the background to the social constants when looking at nonverbal exchanges. Particularly, the reward variance of the communicator is the sum of all the positive and negative attributes the person they are communicating with brings to the encounter, plus the potential he or she of the good or the bad fails somewhere on the scale between those two poles. With that, we assign meaning to that, and we are able to understand what we will do with that in future nonverbal interactions with that person. And so with that, it's important to see how that fits into the theories. So this week we went through a number of theories. We went one, expectancy violation theory, which is solely rooted in nonverbal communication exchanges. Social penetration theory, which is rooted in interpersonal verbal exchanges, and then coordinated management of meaning, on how we assign meaning to communication exchanges. You'll see that all of these deal with relationship development, which is the theme for this week. Expectancy violation theory is looking at proximities, and promixis in terms of looking at how close we are to one another and how nonverbal communication exchanges impact our relationship development, as well as looking at social penetration theory. As we get to know somebody, we peel back more layers, also does that as well. And then coordinated management of meaning helps us manage different communicative experiences in order to assign meaning to those to develop our relationships further. Looking at the week 2 agenda, you can see we're reading chapters 6 through 8. We're watching 3 videos related to the course theories this week. We're completing discussion board number 2, which is due on Friday, with replies on Sunday, and you are posting your midterm topic rationale. I pray you all have a blessed week, and I look forward to interacting with you online. God bless.